Hi, and welcome back to Narwhal News, our weekly podcast where we will be highlighting recent FRC updates, open alliances, and competition predictions, as well as community news from the FRC community in less than 20 minutes. We are FRC Team 3128, the Aluminum Narwhals from Canyon Crest Academy. My name is Bryn, and welcome back to our third episode. Sorry for not posting last week, but we hope our content in the next couple weeks will provide you with the information you need to learn more about FRC and the Reefscape season. Now, let's get started with an Open Alliance update with our strategy coordinator, James. Hey guys, as week one competitions begin to roll around, and many of you are out there putting your finishing touches on your scouting systems, we thought we'd give you a couple of Reefscape-specific scouting insights. I'm here today with our strategy coordinator, James, to go over a couple of them. Hey, James.
Hey, Bryn. I'm so excited to talk to you a little bit about what scouting might look like for Reefscape. So the first thing that we thought about when kickoff began was what kind of data points do we want to collect? And since it's a pick and place game, it's really interesting because you have kind of some limited areas where you can score. So it's up to each team. Do you want to have scouting data for each individual spot on the reef, right? Like, do you want, when they release the game, they put like A through G, I think, for like each
FMS.
of the different size. Yeah. So like, do you want to have a scouting data where it's like, oh, a robot scored in this specific position on L4, or would you rather just have a robot that scored how many on L4, regardless of the location? And for us, we thought that it's more important for you to be able to scout which level that it scored on rather than like the specific location, although that's why we kind of have our qualitative data on the side as well, where you can kind of put, oh, is this robot better at scoring close on the side, especially the parts where the driver station can actually see the reef, or are they better at scoring on the opposite side because of just how their robot is. And I think that's really important. I think adding that complexity where you have to have each individual spot specifically as a data point is not worth it as much as just showing, oh, this robot can score an L4 this much, and then writing about which places it's more likely to score in, things like that.
Yeah, definitely. And as it is with any like pick and place game, driver practice will definitely be important, and I think that's something super important for teams to include in their scouting systems.
Yes,
well.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And next, I kind of want to talk a little bit about just kind of what we thought of in terms of how we could rank different robots in Reefscape. So, even in past years like Crescendo, I think our team kind of found it a little bit hard to kind of rank some of the really, really top teams once you got to Worlds, Like, you could see all these teams, they had very similar autos, very similar teleop cycle counts, things like that. In this game, it's going to be even more tight. I don't know, I saw a Chief Delphi post somewhere that said that cycle times were very, very short this year, which is definitely true because you're only really going about a quarter of the field.
To the driver station.
Yeah, you're only going to the coral stations and then back to the reef pretty much, or you're going to the processor or the barge a little bit. But overall, cycle times, especially just like single coral scoring cycle times, are going to be really short. And that's something you really have to consider in your scouting data. But this is more, I would say, qualitative. It's something to keep out. Oh, is this robot, stopping to take a while at the coral station in terms of how it lines up? Or can it only line up in a specific way? Or, is it really inaccurate at picking up at the coral station? Or let's say, is it better at scoring on this side of the reef? Like I said, how maybe one robot where it feeds the coral through, and then the end effector kind of goes up and just like shoots it out the same way, or if you have a robot that kind of intakes it and then shoots it out the opposite way, those will have different scoring times for either this side of the reef, or like the close side of the reef, or like the far side of the reef, and that kind of can differentiate how cycle times are impacted in just a very short amount. But also it's kind of important to keep that in mind. So.
Yeah, definitely. Especially with like only a half field game, no more full field cycles like Crescendo.
Yeah.
I really don't think like either feeding is going to be a really big strategy this year either. There's going to be very few teams with ground intakes, and shaving that 1 extra second off your cycle could really mean like putting multiple more cycles in throughout a match and really just change the time of that match. So yeah, definitely a valid point there.
And then the last thing I kind of want to talk about is kind of the scouting data points that we considered. So obviously within the matches, you have things like what you want to score, where they scored on L1, L2, L3, L4, how many they scored in the processor, how many they scored in the barge, and then also how many, like how their climbs were. So like if they got a deep climb, if they got a shallow climb, how long that took, how they lined up, things like that. And then also the qualitative things that I was talking about, like, oh, how are they doing their cycles? Oh, do they have this XYZ thing on their processor mechanism that makes it harder to intake or something like that? Those are all things that we thought about in the match, but then also outside of the match, we wanted to look at things like where is the robot picking up coral from? Is it picking up from the ground, like you said? Because there's definitely strategies like that. If you look at Quokka's Part 1 or Robot in 3 Days, the first robot that Quokka's made, that one was definitely very important for ground intaking coral. Or do they just directly take it from the human player station, like we're seeing from a lot of other teams that just have kind of funnels directly into their robot? And then also things like, oh, how do they actually score it? So is it like a roller intake, or is it like a funnel, like I said? Or is it just like they're just using gravity and just like kind of dumping it, like that kind of thing is also really important outside of matches.
Thanks for the advice, James. Do you have any other advice for people designing their scouting systems for Reefscape right now?
So like I said, I think there's a lot of good places you can take inspiration from online, specifically on Chief Delphi. If you just check the scouting subcategory, you can see a lot of different good, well-designed Reefscape scouting systems. And this is kind of a really good segue because I wanted to talk a little bit more about some resources if you want to build a scouting system, and also if you want to just use someone else's pre-made scouting systems. So obviously we have our scouting white paper that we wrote. It's it's less than a year old, so it's still pretty recent, and it has data from Crescendo, as I believe. And it basically has all the stuff that shows how we use our data and how we format it and display it, and all those different UI. We're obviously making changes this year, but that's definitely something you can take inspiration from. And then other things, Viper, I want to just shout out. Viper does a really good job. I think they're making a really good scouting system right now, and their forum is very, very active. They have a lot of cool things, like they have a path planner for pit scouting. So like I said, outside of match, you're also wanting to scout some stuff, so like specific paths of the autos that they might have. And they also have really cool ranking visualizations, which are good. I think that including a box plot is really cool because it does kind of include that complexity between, how consistent is a robot, but also how much does it score on average and things like that. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit about some other resources. So there's Pairwise. Pairwise is cool because it is very qualitative, and you can basically just rank robots and then kind of get an ultimate ranking at the very end of it. And it's also really easy to use and start out with. And then finally, obviously, there's Lovat, which is really, really cool. It's also really nice. What I like about Lovat is it's mobile, and I think a lot of people like that about Lovat because you can really just use it on your phone, and that's the easiest for a lot of people to do. So yeah.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about is human player stuff. So kind of going into what else we wanted to have in our scouting systems in terms of data. Another important thing that we wanted to consider was the human player, obviously, and how they're throwing algae into the barge and how effective or ineffective that they are at that. And so the solution that we're kind of thinking about right now is either having people on a specific person who can scout the human player and how they throw algae, or having one person on each alliance that's scouting an individual robot also scout the barge human player. And then the last thing is when you're creating scouting systems, it's also cool to keep in mind the things such as the Blue Alliance, which if you integrate that into your scouting systems for official events, it's very, very effective in terms of giving actual accurate data that's been collected by FMS. And the things that we can probably count on this year for being on TBA is probably stuff like, oh, did this robot climb specifically on shallow or deep climb successfully, and did they leave in auto? And then also auto RP could have some implications on if they scored a piece in auto and things like that.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us today, James.
Thank you.
4 weeks into the build season, we have a lot of archetypes on OA, and a lot of them seem to overlap. One of the ones I want to go over is the sideways elevator archetype that we've seen on Pioneer 7525, 360 the Revolution, and 694 Stide Pulse. They all have some different variations. For example, Pioneers has a pivoting algae intake at the front of the sideways elevator, and that doesn't really go up or do anything or have anything to do with the elevator, versus Stide Pulse, which has has all their electronics below their funnel to sort of save space on that drivetrain, so they are trying to do a donut climb, which means to save some space on that drivetrain, they move some of the electronics below the funnel to, make some room. They also seem to be trying to do the barge, which means that they attached an algae gripper onto the pivoting pivot on the elevator. And that's another one of the differences that Stide Pulse has from the normal sideways elevator archetypes, is that they have a pivot on the elevator versus just having no pivots and just a manipulator, which pivots so that they can get high enough for placing in the barge. Something else that's different for Stide Pulse is they seem to be attaching the elevator a little further away from the edge. So they might be trying to make some room on that part, and they also have some sort of L1 coral gripper maybe on the side of the robot, since teams have been having trouble with L1 in placing, since it often bounces out with how bouncy the coral is, especially since we've seen from test videos from Rembrandts or Paradox. Which brings me to Paradox's OA post, which
Team 2102.
Yeah, which has been talking about building some sort of a cranberry alarm robot, except they've made their funnel more active funnel, using wheels to move the items on every single wall of the funnel, and it seems to be working pretty well as they funnel those corals straight through, and goes really fast and seems to be very consistent at getting through. And they seem to be posting a lot of videos, which makes me want to highlight them as this week's best OA post, as they post so many special videos about testing and what their issues are. For example, it seems to be chipping stuff off of their funnel, which may cause issues in the future, but it also goes pretty fast. And those videos have helped us figure out what funnels work and what their issues might be or what flaws they might have.
Yeah, I really do love their beta bot.
And that brings us into multiple types of funnels, because you don't have to have a static funnel as well. For example, there's been 2 teams that are building pivoting funnels so that they can save room and space. For example, No Mythic is building a pivoting funnel along with the sort of cranberry alarm pass through to the elevator. And not only that, Robo Spartans are doing that as well with their funnel, so they can pivot down and try to I don't remember fully, but they do have a pivoting elevator, right?
Yeah. I think the use of additional pivots on subsystems is really interesting this year. We've seen a bunch of teams do that, especially with the manipulator. I think time will tell, though, whether the extra degrees of freedom are worth the risk. Remember, they just got their beta, their alpha dev bots done really, really quickly, so they're definitely a great resource for the entire FRC community.
Yeah. Some of those cycle videos has helped us figure out what kind of strategies we want to run at comp, especially knowing hey, what are the cycle counts going to be for specific types of robots or archetypes. Another robot I want to highlight is Team 3255, as she mentioned before, Super Nerds. Especially since they've pretty much got their robot fully designed except for their climber. They do say that they're going to be overweights, which you can sort of see by the amount of pieces that are on that robot and moving parts and degrees of freedom. But it seems to be working very well for them. They've managed to get all levels of the coral working. They've got the algae intake from the ground as well, it seems, and they even got like an active funnel so that they can filter pieces easier. Something they did also try was placing algae in the barge, but it seems that their algae intake such manipulator is a little too low, and it just won't make it in, which may mean they either have to redesign or figure something out.
Yeah, no, I think the weight limit is definitely going to be a struggle for a lot of teams this year, and that's a trend I've also seen on Chief Delphi as well. A lot of teams have gone to extreme lengths, like pocketing their entire intake just to shave off a little bit of weight there. So definitely something to keep in mind as teams continue to develop and prototype their robots.
Another archetype I want to highlight is going back to Jack in the Bot from 2023. We've seen multiple teams try to build around that. For example, we saw the Terabytes, 4561. They seem to be building some sort of like Jack in the Bot inspired design with an algae and a coral gripper on their robot. We also saw Team 1787, the Flying Circuits, starting to sort of cat around it and try to make that that pivot work so low. And another one we saw was Team 6995 Nomad, who recently posted about trying to get that to work as well, especially with the algae manipulator on the edge. Although they did say that they might change the manipulator because they didn't really find the geometry working too well.
It's definitely an interesting concept. I think we'll see how that plays out week one. For me, I think the tilted elevator is an interesting choice, but to each their own.
Yeah. And then speaking of tilted elevators, we have Mechanical Advantage, who recently posted about the lower the funnel that's placed lower on their robot that sort of more actively filters than just a passive funnel. And they also have a tilted elevator on it with frontal algae intake as well. It seems to be very heavy, but it has its benefits because keeping a lower funnel means that their CG is lower. You might be able to maybe add ground intake later on in the season, and it also filters easier to a lower point, which means that you can have your manipulator go lower to the ground, especially with the funnel lower. And we've seen them build that tilted elevator and try to figure out that geometry on placing coral as well.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. Definitely not like your typical static elevator you've seen on a lot of robots and archetypes so far.
Yeah. And then finally, another team I want to highlight is Team 111 Wild Sting. They pretty much built their robot, other than maybe the climber, which involves sort of which involves a sideways elevator that has a pivot with one side doing algae and one side doing coral. It means that they can hold two game pieces at once, one algae, one coral, which allows for optimal cycles if needed. Some teams may be able to hold one or the other, but they're trying to build to hold both. It also seems that they're trying to build for the barge. We'll see how they can place it in the barge. But their coral placing seems to be very consistent. Getting that L4, which some teams have been having trouble with, especially for the geometry on that. They seem to have it down. One of the big issues they had was trying to intake from a bigger variety of locations. So for example, if you're offset a tiny bit when trying to intake, it seems to be having a little bit of issues, but I'm sure they'll figure it out. There's still multiple weeks left. But they have a working robot, which means they can drive practice. They can figure out what the cycle times may be, especially for their specific robot, and what their pros and cons might be.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, yeah. In an ideal world, drive practice starts now until week one.
Yeah. And then another team that's been building recently is 4481. We finally see them sort of get into the groove and start manufacturing and building. We saw their robot that looks very much like Red Ion and try to do barge algae as well. And they nearly got the barge algae working, although it seems to be a little short. But their coral seems to be very consistent, hitting all four level, like L2, L3, L4, maybe L1 if they get it a little more consistent. But they finally have an up and working robot, which means we might see some more developing videos from them.
All right, thank you so much for joining us today, Abraham. I really appreciate your Open Alliance insight. I think it's safe to say that RuScape has been one of the best years for Open Alliance so far, with lots of great threads and community resources available to the community. Over the last couple weeks, we've seen a slew of team updates come out from First. So today we're going to go over some of the most important team updates from the last couple updates. I chose to focus on more of the updates that impacted teams directly, so we'll just get started into that. First, from Team Update 7, the expanded interpretation of a major foul has been revised so that it went from a robot in violation of this type of rule, a major foul, for 15 seconds receives a total of 4 major foul points, assuming that no other rules were being simultaneously violated, to 6 major fouls. So definitely an increase right there. From Team Update 8, there are more updates to consider. First of all, a clarification has been added to the scoring element scoring criteria for coral, stating that a coral is scored in the trough/L1 of the reef if not in contact with the robot and not scored on any other level of the reef. Additionally, in section 7.4.3, there's been more clarification and a revision to the points eligible for robots when touching the anchor. As a reminder, anchors are off limits and robots may not touch the anchors. Exceptions will be granted for actions that are momentary and inconsequential. However, the consequence for touching an anchor has been revised from a major foul, and the entire alliance is not eligible for the barge RP if in a qualification match, to that the robot itself is not eligible for any cage points. So they've kind of revised this so that touching the anchor won't affect the entire alliance, rather the individual robot. Additionally, something to note for teams at competition. First is providing 1 crosshatch algae minimum, which is representative of the algae used on the competition field. At the practice field, teams may not damage or remove it from practice areas, and additional algae may be available depending on supply. Additionally, more clarification has been added so that human players are welcome to practice throwing algae into the practice field net as long as the area around it is free from any humans or other robots that may potentially be hit. Priority will of course be given to robot practice over human player practice, and teams hoping to train their human players must bring their own algae for throwing. That's all the team updates for now. Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode of Narwhal News. We're so glad you're here. As always, comment down below on our Spotify or our YouTube if there are any other topics, events, or robots you'd like us to cover or go more in depth to. Keep on swimming and see you guys next week.